Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a moment in your life when silence becomes louder than every word you ever spoke. A moment when you realize the people who hurt you were never listening, they were just comfortable knowing you would stay. But what happens when you don't? What happens when you stop explaining, stop chasing, and simply walk away? That's when absence becomes power, because the ones who took your presence for granted don't feel your value while you're there. They feel it the moment you're gone. The ones who hurt you will regret your absence, not because you disappeared, but because you stopped explaining yourself. For a long time you stayed hoping they would understand. You stayed believing that if you just tried harder, spoke softer, gave more, things would change. But what you eventually learn is this: people don't value what they don't have to earn, and they rarely respect what they believe will always remain. At first, your presence felt invisible. You were there, but unnoticed. You listened, but you weren't heard. You gave your energy, your time, your loyalty, and it became normal, expected, taken for granted, and that's how it works. When something is always available, we stop recognizing its value, not because it isn't valuable, but because it's familiar. So you started to shrink, you questioned yourself, you wondered if you were asking for too much, feeling too deeply, expecting too honestly. You tried to adjust, to adapt, to become easier to keep. But here's the truth we often ignore. When you constantly adjust yourself to fit a place that keeps hurting you, you're not growing, you're disappearing. Your absence is not revenge, it's clarity. It's the moment you decide that your self-respect matters more than your need to be understood by people who never tried to understand you in the first place. And that decision changes everything, because when you leave, something interesting happens. The silence you create becomes louder than all the words you ever said. The space you once filled becomes obvious. The support you gave, the consistency you offered, the care you showed, suddenly it's missing. And only then do they feel it. People don't miss you when you're always there. They miss you when the benefits of your presence are gone. When the encouragement stops, when the reliability disappears, when the emotional safety they leaned on is no longer available. That's when regret begins to form, not because they lost you, but because they lost what you gave, and that regret doesn't come immediately. First comes confusion, then denial, then realization. They replay conversations, they remember moments they dismissed. They recognize boundaries they crossed, and slowly, they understand that what they thought would always stay chose to walk away. But here's the most important part: your absence is not meant to teach them a lesson, it's meant to remind you of your worth. You don't leave so they can feel pain. You leave so you can feel peace. You see, leadership in your own life begins when you stop begging for respect and start setting standards. When you stop trying to be chosen and start choosing yourself. When you understand that walking away doesn't mean you lost. It means you finally listened to what your values were trying to tell you. And the people who hurt you, they will regret it, quietly, privately, in moments when they need what you once provided. In times when they realize how rare your consistency was, how uncommon your loyalty felt once it was gone, how difficult it is to replace someone who genuinely cared, but by then you won't be watching, you'll be building. Growing, standing in environments where your presence is noticed, appreciated, and respected, places where you don't have to prove your worth because it's already seen. Absence changes people, but presence changes you. And when you finally choose absence over self-betrayal, you don't just leave a space behind, you reclaim your direction, your strength, and your identity. And in reclaiming that identity, something shifts inside you. You begin to notice how much energy you were spending just to stay connected to places that drained you. How much emotional labor went into keeping peace while losing yourself. You realize that strength was never about endurance alone. It was about knowing when endurance turns into self-neglect. For a long time you confused loyalty with sacrifice. You believed that staying, even when it hurt, was proof of your character. But loyalty without mutual respect is not a virtue, it's a warning sign. It signals that you are giving more than the relationship can return. And when that imbalance becomes normal, it slowly erodes your confidence. Walking away forces you to confront a difficult truth. Not everyone who has access to you deserves it. Access is earned through consistency, honesty, and care. When those things are missing, distance becomes necessary, not dramatic. And distance has a purpose. It gives you perspective. From that perspective, you start to see patterns you once excused. The moments where your needs were minimized, the times your boundaries were tested, the occasions when silence was used instead of accountability. These weren't isolated incidents, they were signals. Signals you ignored because you wanted to believe in potential rather than reality. Absence sharpens reality. Without you there to soften the consequences, people are forced to face their own behavior. And while some may grow from that awareness, others won't. But growth on their part is no longer your responsibility. That's another lesson absence teaches you. You are not responsible for fixing what you didn't break. There is courage in choosing yourself when you've been taught to prioritize everyone else. Courage in saying, "This no longer aligns with who I am becoming." Because when you leave, you're not just stepping away from pain, you're stepping toward alignment. Alignment with your values. Alignment with your future. Alignment with the person you are meant to become. And that alignment brings clarity. You become more intentional about where you invest your time and energy. You stop explaining your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. You stop chasing validation and start building internal certainty. That certainty becomes your anchor. The people who hurt you may try to fill the space you left. They may look for replacements, distractions, or noise. But depth is not easily replaced. Consistency is rare. Genuine care is uncommon. And when they encounter interactions that feel shallow compared to what you offered, that's when the absence becomes undeniable. Still, your focus isn't on their realization, it's on your transformation. You begin to trust yourself again. You listen to your instincts instead of dismissing them. You recognize discomfort not as something to suppress, but as information guiding you toward better choices. This is where growth accelerates. When you're no longer weighed down by environments that question your value, you move faster. You think clearer, you dream bigger, you attract people who meet you with the same effort you give. Not because you're trying harder, but because you've raised the standard for access to your life. Absence also teaches restraint. You learn that not every truth needs to be spoken, and not every wound needs to be revisited. Sometimes the most powerful response is consistency in your actions, not explanations in your words. Silence, when chosen intentionally, becomes a form of self-respect. You start to understand that being missed is not the goal. Being respected is, and respect begins with how you treat yourself when no one else is watching, when you choose not to tolerate what diminishes you. When you choose environments that challenge you without breaking you, there will be moments when doubt creeps in, moments when you wonder if leaving was too much, too harsh, too final. But those moments pass when you remember how much peace costs and how much you were willing to pay to protect it. Peace is not found in familiar pain, it's found in honest distance. And as you continue forward, your absence becomes permanent not because you hold resentment, but because you've moved beyond the need for validation from those who once caused you harm. You are no longer reacting, you are leading yourself. The regret they feel belongs to them. The growth you experience belongs to you. And every step you take away from what hurt you is a step closer to a life built on respect, intention, and quiet strength. That quiet strength begins to show up in ways you didn't expect, in how you speak with more certainty, in how you pause before saying yes, in how you no longer rush to prove your intentions. You realize that confidence is not loud, it is consistent. It doesn't argue for space, it assumes it. You also begin to understand that pain was never the enemy. Avoiding it was. Pain clarified what comfort tried to hide. It revealed where you were compromising your values just to keep connections intact. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Awareness changes behavior, it always does. You stop romanticizing struggle as a requirement for belonging. You no longer believe that love must hurt to be real, or that loyalty must be painful to be meaningful. Instead, you redefine what healthy connection looks like: mutual effort, clear communication, respect that doesn't need reminders. And when those elements are missing, you no longer negotiate with yourself. What surprises you most is how much lighter life feels when you stop carrying emotional weight that was never yours. You're not constantly anticipating disappointment. You're not replaying conversations in your head. You're not bracing yourself for the next moment of disrespect disguised as honesty. That mental freedom gives you back time, focus, and energy. With that energy, you start building something new, new habits, new standards, new relationships that don't require you to shrink. You notice how different it feels to be around people who celebrate your presence instead of tolerating it. People who listen without defensiveness, people who don't disappear when accountability enters the room. And here's the shift that defines everything. You no longer fear being misunderstood. You understand that being misunderstood by the wrong people is a sign you're no longer betraying yourself. When your actions are aligned with your values, clarity replaces anxiety. The ones who hurt you may try to reconnect when they sense this change. Not always with words, but with subtle gestures, curiosity, nostalgia, familiar patterns disguised as growth. But you've learned the difference between remorse and loneliness, between real change and temporary awareness. You no longer confuse apologies with accountability. You look for behavior, not promises. You listen to consistency, not intensity. Because intensity fades, but patterns reveal truth, and this time you trust what you see. Absence has trained you to respond instead of react, to observe instead of assume, to choose long-term peace over short-term comfort. You don't rush decisions anymore. You don't chase closure. You understand that closure is not something someone gives you. It's something you claim when you decide you've learned enough. You begin to respect your past self for surviving, but you no longer let that past define your future. Survival was necessary then. Growth is necessary now, and growth requires space. Space to think, space to heal, space to become someone who doesn't repeat cycles just because they're familiar. There's also forgiveness, but not the kind that excuses behavior. It's the kind that releases you from carrying resentment forward. Forgiveness becomes a boundary, not an invitation. It allows you to move on without reopening doors that lead back to the same pain. You realize that absence didn't make you cold. It made you clear. It didn't harden your heart, it protected it. You're still capable of empathy, but now it's paired with discernment. You still care, but you care with limits, and limits are what keep generosity from turning into self-abandonment. Over time, your life begins to reflect your internal shift. You're drawn to environments that feel calm, not chaotic. Conversations that feel honest, not exhausting. Goals that excite you, not distract you. And as your world becomes more intentional, the noise from the past fades. You stop measuring your worth by how much you can endure. You measure it by how well you honor yourself, by how quickly you walk away from what disrespects you, by how intentionally you stay where you are valued. And without realizing it, you become an example, not by preaching, but by living differently. People notice your boundaries, your composure, your unwillingness to tolerate what once hurt you, and some will be inspired by it. Others will be uncomfortable. Both reactions confirm that change has occurred. The absence that once felt like a loss now feels like space. Space where growth happened, space where clarity formed, space where strength matured. And every day you continue forward, you reinforce the truth that choosing yourself was never an act of selfishness. It was an act of leadership over your own life. That leadership becomes more evident in the decisions you no longer explain. You don't announce boundaries, you live them. You don't argue your value, you demonstrate it through where you invest your presence. And slowly, you realize that the strongest signal you can send is not a message, not a confrontation, but consistency in who you are willing to be. You become comfortable with being selective, not distant, not guarded, but intentional. You understand now that saying no to what drains you is saying yes to what builds you. And that choice removes guilt from your life. Guilt only existed when you believed your role was to keep everyone comfortable, even at your own expense. You begin to see how often you were mistaking familiarity for safety, Just because something was known didn't mean it was healthy. Just because it was familiar didn't mean it was right. And once you detach from that illusion, you stop returning to places that require you to silence parts of yourself to belong. There is also patience now, patience with your own process. Healing didn't happen overnight, and you no longer expect it to. You allow yourself to move forward without rushing closure, without demanding answers that may never come. You accept that some questions resolve themselves through distance, not dialogue. With patience comes trust. Trust in your judgment, trust in your instincts, trust that when something feels wrong, it probably is. You no longer override that inner signal just to keep peace. You respect it, you protect it, because that inner voice was always there. You just weren't listening. And as you listen more closely, your standards rise naturally, not out of arrogance, but out of experience. You've learned what happens when standards are too low. You've felt the cost of tolerating behavior that chipped away at your self-worth. So now your expectations are clear, calm, and non-negotiable. The people who once benefited from your silence may struggle with this version of you. They may say you've changed, and they're right, you have. You changed because staying the same was no longer an option. You changed because growth demanded it. You changed because the old version of you survived by adapting, and the new version thrives by choosing. You no longer seek to be liked by everyone. You seek alignment, and alignment doesn't require approval. It requires honesty, honesty with yourself first, then with the world around you. When those two align, confidence follows naturally. Your absence also taught you something unexpected. Not everyone who loses access to you will reflect. Some will blame, some will minimize, some will rewrite the story to protect their image, and that's no longer your concern. You don't correct narratives that were never meant to honor you. You let actions speak where explanations once stood. That restraint is a form of power. It shows you no longer need external validation to confirm what you already know. You don't chase understanding from people who refused to listen when it mattered. You trust that the right people don't need convincing. As time passes, you notice how rarely you think about the hurt compared to how often you think about what you're building. The focus has shifted from what was taken to what is being created, from what went wrong to what is possible. And that shift changes everything. You start to see opportunities where you once saw obstacles. You take risks that once felt impossible because your energy is no longer tied up in emotional recovery. You move with intention, not hesitation, with purpose, not fear. And in those moments when the past tries to resurface, when memories test your resolve, you don't fight them. You acknowledge them, you thank them for the lesson, and you keep moving, because you know now that growth doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning without returning. Your presence, once taken for granted, is now reserved, not withheld out of bitterness, but protected out of wisdom. You give it where it is reciprocated, where effort meets effort, where respect is mutual, not conditional. And in doing so, you become someone who doesn't need to be missed to be valuable, someone who doesn't need regret from others to confirm their worth. Someone who understands that the most meaningful transformation happens quietly, consistently, and without permission. You don't measure success by who notices your absence anymore. You measure it by how aligned you feel when you wake up, by how peaceful your decisions are, by how little you compromise who you are to keep connections alive. That peace becomes your compass, it guides your choices, it informs your boundaries. It reminds you that walking away was never about leaving something behind, but about stepping into a version of yourself that no longer accepts less than respect, less than honesty, less than effort, and less than the life you are now intentionally creating.